Everyone. Thanks for being here on a Tuesday afternoon. My name is Shelby. I'm the Professional and Organizational Development Director for Montana Nonprofit Association. For those of you that have been on a town hall or attended a training or signed on a call to action in the past, you know that Montana Nonprofit Association believes that nonprofits are vital for the health and well-being of our communities, our families, our individuals, and ourselves across the state of Montana. And that belief drives us to ensure you have what you need to do what you've got to do. Sorry for the puppy yips. We're here today due to the reopening to talk a little bit through your own decision-making processes, and we're really lucky to have Chani here. Chani has extensive experience as a backgrounder, as a fundraiser in Montana, as well as a researcher, and has worked with us on our principles and practices of nonprofit excellence. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to her. Please chat in through the box, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I am going to share my screen right now. So as we get started here, I so appreciate that you are all here today. There is so much that we are thinking through right now. So I wanted just to start off and just show some photos from this weekend. These were in the Daily Interlake, in the Flathead Beacon. I live in Big Fork, and then also from Billings, just showing just little pictures of what it is like in different places in Montana. So one of the things to know is that we will be covering a lot of information today. However, I would encourage you to go ahead and use the chat to ask questions, make comments. Adam and Shelby will be monitoring that, and they will stop me with any questions that you might have. So just a little bit of what we're going to cover today. We're going to go ahead and talk about protecting public trust in decision-making and messaging as we go through this reopening. I'm going to share with you some of my underlying assumptions going forward. Then we're going to talk about this particular framework, some examples of its use. We will be providing this handout, this PowerPoint for you, and there are several questions that I'll be going over just to think through some of your decisions. We're going to talk about messaging, both to insiders and also just your target audience, and then talk about some of those pitfalls, end with decision paralysis, which we can all get into, and then have some time for questions and answers. With that, let's go ahead and just take a step back. The first thing to really consider as an underlying assumption is that there was a specific purpose for the stay-at-home order, and that was to flatten the curve. It was not to prevent outbreaks. It was not to prevent infections. It was not to prevent deaths. It was to make sure that we flattened the curve, we slowed the spread of the virus, so that our healthcare system could handle the number of infections and the number of expected hospitalizations. So one of the things to think about as we are moving through this is in Montana, we experienced in 1918, we were the fourth most impacted state in the United States. And so we had experience of what happens when things go wrong, when we have a huge virus spread. I am, as a fourth generation Montana, really incredibly proud of us that we are now in the least affected, the top 4 least affected states. And so that's something to be very much proud of, and that's a blessing for us. But it does come with some caveats, and that is because most Montanans do not know somebody who has had the virus or has been hospitalized or has died from this. There can be a lot of confusion of why we have taken these steps to stay at home, to close down the economy when it doesn't seem real here. Yet, we know that the cases are coming in the coming weeks. When we look at the containment strategy recommendations from the Institute of Health Matrix and Evaluation, and this was done on April 17th, when we look at those recommendations, we can see the states where they're still increasing in the number of infections, the number of hospitalizations, and the number of deaths that they're experiencing. As you can see, and if you look in the lower left or the lower right hand corner, you can see that some of the states that are neighboring us, South Dakota, North Dakota, those states, based on the threshold of virus infections, were not expected to open up until after June 8th. So that's a significant time period away from us. So what we know is that as different folks from around the nation come back to Montana, they may be snowbirds, they may be vacation homeowners, we can expect that we will see an increase of cases, we will see an increase of infections, hospitalizations, and deaths. So it is something that we can expect. Moreover, because we are going through the phased reopening, we can expect after 2 weeks, we're going to see a number of cases that will increase again. Which leads me to the next point, and that is this study or this poll that was taken over the beginning of April, and they actually asked what the readiness was to reopen the economy. And this is really important because before this poll had been taken, there was this assumption based on the loudest voices, that there was a huge desire to reopen completely quickly. But as you can see, there is a wait and see what happens approach across various different subgroups. And I want to point out some really important ones to think about, especially as we are considering the fact that we will be seeing increases of infections coming. First of all, is if you look at the type of community, city, suburb versus rural and small town America, and this is a national poll, but you see that 66% of folks actually wanted to take a wait and see approach to what would be happening. Then, if you look at the party identification, we also see that it is not as polarized as we would have expected. If you look at it, you see a range between about 80% down to 60%, which is actually not that much compared to a lot of the polarization that we've experienced. The next thing to observe in this particular poll is the employment status. As you can see, 71% of folks who are not working right now, these are unemployed, 71% want to take a seat, wait and see what happens. And when you think about that in terms of the number of folks who are experiencing unemployment and the financial stress that that can cause, that's quite surprising. And we're going to go more in depth in that in just a moment. And then the final piece of information that this really provides us with is that those who are above the age of 65 overwhelmingly want to take a wait and see approach. It's at 73%. That matters for us as nonprofits in particular, as we're thinking about engaging our volunteers. Our volunteers may be more hesitant to commit to different activities because they're not sure what is going to happen. So as we move forward in these phased reopenings, based on what the polling is showing, based on the fact that we are going to see more infections in the coming weeks, what we need to be aware of is that we have to expect anxiety. We have to expect that there will be a sudden changing of minds. You'll get a commitment from somebody and then they will pull back and they'll change their mind. There will be that inconsistency that we're going to expect. What that means for us as nonprofits is that we have to be incredibly invitational right now, meaning that we have to invite people to come in, understanding that there is going to be a lot of fear and uncertainty that will develop. As we are invitational and not demanding, not expecting, but invitational, we can help ease some of those fears moving forward. And to let those who do trust us and have trusted us in the past know that we care about them and we are concerned about their fears and their anxieties, and that we are going to continue to adapt what we're doing based on that. So looking back at that, the poll where it said those who are employed versus not employed, I do want to point out something that's very important to consider as we reopen. And that is the impact of the employment benefits. Right now, there is an additional $600 that is provided each week in unemployment benefits compared to what the typical unemployment benefit was for the state of Montana. In this chart, you will see that I have highlighted the state of Montana. We are just below 120% of average wage in terms of the unemployment benefits. What that means is that those who are on unemployment right now are earning through unemployment $15 plus an hour in unemployment benefits. If we make that an hourly rate, it's over $15 an hour. That is really important to consider when we're thinking about those employees we may have furloughed or those employees who are currently still working with us, but we have to consider this in terms of what are their considerations in moving forward. If they continue to have childcare challenges, if the schools remain closed in the next couple of months, then you're going to see that a lot of families are going to make the choice to remain on unemployment, then return back to work. We will also see that there will be employees who will ask to be furloughed because it is frankly more costly for them to remain employed with us than for them to go on unemployment. And one of the things to remember about these benefits is that they're 26 weeks long, so half of the year long. The other piece to point out with this particular chart is, and I've highlighted the surrounding states, for those of us who are operating on the border towns to the different states, you can see that all of our border states are facing the same issue. So that for them, they too have an issue where it is more practical for some employees to remain on unemployment than to return back to work. And then I also just want to throw out that for our northern border, which is Canada, that border is likely to remain closed for the next month and beyond. So it does impact economically, and it impacts our employees moving forward. From here, we can also look at some of the lessons that we learned with the Great Depression. Now, you may wonder, why am I talking about the Great Depression? So when we are looking at different recessions and economic shocks that we have, we are not only looking at the stock market, but we're also looking at credit, we're looking at unemployment, and we're looking at housing. Those are all some key indicators to look at what is the economic stability of our nation. I am very blessed to know some fundraising colleagues, fellow consultants, who have really dug into some of the numbers. And what they are seeing, and I would agree with, is that we are going to be closer to the Great Depression in terms of the economic shock that this is occurring than we are going to be for the recession. So it's something just to keep in mind as we plan and we think about being conservative with our financial management. One lesson that we've learned from the Great Depression is that giving actually increased at the beginning of the Great Depression. And you saw from 1929 to 1931 where giving was increasing as a portion of GDP. Then from 1931 to 1933, we saw a significant decrease in giving. It decreased by 24%. After 1933, we saw that giving was increasing yet again. And then in 1937, we actually hit the point where giving actually surpassed the 1929 level. So we can expect that, and we are actually seeing it right now, that we're going to see giving increase for a time. And then we're going to see and this is something that we have tracked with other recessions and other economic shocks, we will see that giving will decrease. And then we'll see a return to giving. Along with this, we also have to consider the fact that we're going to see a decrease in giving from private foundations. Private foundations are, the giving rates that they give out, the expenditure rates, will decrease the amount of grants that they're giving out because of the stock market. And then with the stock market declines, we'll see a decrease in grants. We have already, through some initial polling of private foundations, seen that a number of them are going to decrease their grant making in 2021. And finally, another thing to consider is that state and local budgets are severely impacted by all of the loss of revenue from taxes, and then you also see that loss of revenue, a increase of its spending for how they are trying to meet the challenges of the coronavirus. So we can expect some changes in some of our state and even federal contracts. So one of the things to consider moving forward is, what is your financial management plan, and how do you prepare for the longer term that this will occur over? It's really important that you're not spending all of your reserves right now. And it's really important as you're thinking about rehiring some of your employees, thinking about, will you in the long term be able to sustain them at that level of employment, especially with whatever expected services that you will be providing. So that's the underlying assumptions. Now I'm going to go into a framework to consider using in your decision making. So one of the principles that we in the nonprofit world have to be aware of is this idea of public trust. Unlike the for-profit world, where there's a direct connection between consumer and the business, the consumer provides the revenue for the business, we have a unique triangle in the nonprofit world, and that is that the consumer of our services, the beneficiary, oftentimes is not the person who actually provides the revenue for it. Because of that, public trust is a more important principle that we have to be aware of. I am a fundraising consultant, and so I've been doing some research on fundraising ethics over the last few years. And there's this principle from fundraising that I think really applies, and that is that the duty of a nonprofit is to its mission and is to who and what it serves, whether or not it's people, animals, a place, advocacy. Our duty is to that mission. But it has to be balanced, and it has to be balanced to the right of our staff, volunteers, stakeholders, and donors, not to be subjected to undue pressure. Because when there is that undue pressure, then that public trust starts to erode. So I've thought about this in terms of a continuum. There is, on one part of the continuum, that idea of public perception and liability. And then it moves to, how do we steward our resources? And then how do we lead in the community? Now on this, the left-hand side where it has public perception and liability, We will be providing you more information through the Montana Nonprofit Association about some of those resources you may have as an employer to reduce some of your liability moving forward. But we also have to think about that public perception. As you are considering this continuum, I want you to just picture a room. Picture a room from at the very bottom, the floor level decision making is going to be that public perception and that liability. And then it increases in terms of the decision making up to a ceiling level ethic of the best practices that we might consider in terms of leading in our communities. One thing to realize about this is that if we make our decisions based solely on public perception and the liability issues, it will affect how our donors perceive us. It will affect what revenue we may receive from them, what contributions we may receive from them. Now, if we think about a decision that we could make that doesn't meet those basic level public perception or liabilities issues, it will affect our operation. If we make a flawed decision and it fails to meet the basic level of public trust, then we run the risk of actually failing as an organization and actually no longer being able to serve our community. So it's really important that we at least take in consideration public perception and liability issues in all of our decisions. Now, as we move along the continuum, we're going to be thinking more about managing relationships. And then we're going to be on the other side of the continuum after stewarding resources is how do we serve the community more? How do we be in service to our community? In the middle is that idea of stewarding resources. And that is not only do we think about our financial management, but we also think about caring for the people that we serve. That is not only externally with our clients, our patrons, our stakeholders, but it's also internally. How do we serve those who are closest to us, our board members, our staff, our volunteers, our donors? And then how do we carry out our mission based on stewarding our resources? A key point is that people do matter. And it doesn't matter if we're able to manage our financial resources if we've ruined the relationships with those key individuals. Now, as we think about this particular framework, we do have to realize that the decisions are going to occur along this continuum of public trust. We have to remain adaptable to changing conditions. As I mentioned, we are going to see an increase of infections. That means there might be some of our areas in the state of Montana that will go back into lockdown. So we have to remain adaptable and know that things will be changing. We also have to make sure that we're thinking about each decision sphere separately. So how you may think about this protection of public trust with your employees is going to be different than carrying out some of your outreach activities. So each of them are going to be at a separate level along the continuum. And so you're going to see multiple decisions across this continuum. Now, I'd like to give you some examples of ways that you can use this idea of public trust. So I am a big sports fan, and I actually had tickets to the NCAA March Madness that was going to be occurring in Spokane. The NCAA is a nonprofit 501c3 organization. As they were considering March Madness, which is when they bring teams across the country to play in a tournament towards a championship, they could have chosen to lead in the community. When they saw that there were infections in all of the locations of all of their tournaments, They could have at that point said, we're going to lead in our community and we're going to go ahead and cancel the tournament at that point. They didn't. Then one by one, various different teams said that they would not participate in the tournament. So they could have thought about it as stewarding their resources and said, you know, we have all of these teams who are refusing to participate at this point for the good of the athletes, for the good of our schools, for the good of our fans. We're going to go ahead and cancel the tournament. They didn't. Instead, they started talking about flying all of the teams in and having the tournament without any fans. At the same time, while this conversation was going on, the NBA, a for-profit entity, the NBA was actually starting to cancel games. They were talking about how to have games without fans, but then they also decided to cancel their season. And they actually decided to cancel their season on March 11th. And then at that point, the NCAA, a nonprofit, had to choose whether or not they were going to, in the liability and the public perception, whether or not they were going to continue along the path that they had decided when a for-profit entity had decided not to, or whether or not they would cancel the tournament. So the next day, on March 12th, they canceled the tournament. So that just shows how that decision-making could be along that continuum. I'm working with a client right now in Georgia, and they have the opportunity to fully reopen their animal shelter. The executive director, in looking at that idea of stewarding resources, she has decided not to open the animal shelter yet because she knows that so many of her volunteers are in the at-risk vulnerable population. So she's deciding to wait. She could, from a public perception liability standpoint, open, but she's deciding to steward her resources. Now, an example of leading in the community, maybe making a requirement to wear a mask and having all employees wear masks as a part, and volunteers wear a mask as a part of serving the community in whatever outreach that you are doing. What we have seen nationwide is there has been a bit of a challenge with that, and that is from a specific population. We're seeing African Americans and Black Americans experiencing some discrimination, and even the police being called when they're wearing a mask, even though they're in areas that require wearing a mask. So where a nonprofit may have thought, oh, we're going to lead in the community and we're going to require, even though it's not a requirement in the state of Montana, but we're going to require wearing a mask to steward the resources of their employees, to maintain the relationship with their employees. They may choose not to require wearing a mask for that very reason. So I'd like to give you some questions just to consider as you're thinking through some of the decisions you make in the coming weeks. We're going to start with just that basic level of decision making, that basic level of that ethics. One question to consider, of course, is how are the for-profits handling various different decisions? And we don't want to be worse than the for-profits, just to be honest. It will not look good for us if the for-profit entities in our communities are making better decisions with liability and public perception than we are. Next is we have to think about what is the reaction to those who are closest to our organizations. Some of you may have an audience that is more on the let's open up immediately, and some of you maybe have the audience that doesn't feel comfortable yet. And so we have to acknowledge that difference. We have to look at the comfort level of our employees. Are they going to be honest with you and talking about what their vulnerabilities are to the virus and whether or not they're in an at-risk group? We don't necessarily know just by looking at somebody if they are, or the loved ones that they are caring for in their homes. We can also look to the fact that, as the photo I showed at the very beginning, we saw that churches were only a third to a half full when they opened up on Sunday. This really speaks to that level of comfort in our community, that there might be some folks who just don't feel comfortable yet. And then the next thing to think about is, how are you having those risk management conversations with your board? And I do want to do a shout out to one of my colleagues, Ned Cooney. He has a blog right now with various different conversations you need to have in terms of this risk management, about just various different conversations and some of the decisions that you need to make with your board. So think about, what are those conversations that you need to have, and what gaps you might need to fill before you implement the decision. Moving on to that middle level, and that middle level is thinking about stewarding our resources. And that is where you're thinking more in depth about some of the social distancing guidelines, how you're going to protect and steward and care for your employees, your volunteers, your donors, your stakeholders. And then also thinking about the financial management issues. So with the social distancing, it is really important to think about what will be changed in our organization's culture as we implement them, which ones can't be, and what might there be, what limitations might there be, either socioeconomic or cultural. If you are asking all of your employees to wear a mask, is that culturally going to be appropriate? Can they afford some of the costs of, let's say, making or buying a mask right now? So we do have to think about that. Now, there are some organizations where having these social distancing guidelines will not change anything. For example, a trail work organization where everybody already had to be 6 feet apart, because when you take a Pulaski and you're digging dirt, you have to be far enough away. Implementing these social distancing guidelines will not be difficult. But another organization, let's say a symphony, having a 6 feet apart for all of your orchestra members, and then having enough seating difference between those who are attending, that's going to be very difficult, and that changes the nature of what the event looks like. It's also something to think about if you do outreach, for example, in a farmer's market. If you're doing voter registration, will those farmer markets even happen? What would it mean for you to approach somebody on the street wearing a mask? Will there be any concerns? Will it be well received? So we have to think about that, what cultural challenges we might run into. We need to think about, how do we show our employees that we care, and how do we make sure we have open communication so our employees and our volunteers can express some of their concerns. And then finally, when we're thinking about stewarding resources, we have to prepare for the 6 months after the crisis is over. And as I mentioned, we have to think about, do we rehire everyone if we have furloughed folks? Are we using our reserves right now at a higher level than expected? We may be seeing an increase in the number of donation dollars that are coming in, but what will the impact of other funding sources be? And then on this in the final element of this continuum, some of the considerations that you may ask yourself is, how are we expected to lead in our community already? I think especially for advocacy groups where we have said, here, we are the leader in this, please follow us. We may be expected to lead in various different areas that other nonprofits might not be expected to lead. For example, if you are a job training organization and you're laying off employees, there is a mixed message there. And so that might be an area where you have a very in-depth conversation with the board and talking about how do we manage through this, and what are we going to sacrifice some of our resources because we need to continue to lead in our community. The next question is how would the decision be embraced by the insiders, the staff, the volunteers, the stakeholders? If, for example, you require that all employees wear a mask, but your leaders don't, no one will. And so you do have to think about how can we help for any decision we make? How can we help those insiders actually embrace that decision and implement it? Now, one of the things to also think about when we're thinking about those sacrifices and those consequences that our organizations can experience for the long term is we don't know what is coming. We don't know. There is so much uncertainty around this virus. And so it is a regular conversation that we're going to have. So you may decide right now that we're going to lead in the community for this particular decision. And then as we move forward, as the virus, for example, comes back in the fall, you may decide that we need to have a totally different decision. And instead, we're going to look at how do we just meet our liability issues that we have. Now, I have provided, and there's a link in the chat room, that is just a worksheet that you can use as you're making these decisions. Now, this worksheet is just meant to be a brainstorming exercise so that you can make plans to adapt as you move forward with this. So when you use this worksheet, as I mentioned, it is for brainstorming. Just scribble in where the decision falls along the continuum, what considerations you were making as you made the decision so that you can present those considerations to your board and your leadership. Record anything that might cause a change and could alter those decisions. You can put it under the caveat column, and then define any of the key messages that you need to have for insiders and your target audience. And of course, you're going to have to plan to review these at each phase of reopen, and if we have to slow down. So just know that this is just a brainstorming worksheet just to help you record some of your thoughts around this. Now we're going to go ahead and shift gears, and we're going to talk about messaging. So just some messaging essentials right now. I am not a crisis communications expert. I am also not a marketing expert, but in fundraising, we are thinking about these issues around messaging. And one of the first things to realize is that there is a cognitive overload that affects the ability to listen and to process information. And we are there. There is so much information, there is so much fear, there is so much uncertainty that it is difficult for us to actually listen and process information. So as we are creating our messages, it is absolutely essential that we keep them simple. So instead of writing a long email, we'll be very concise and simple. Instead of a long, lengthy sign on the outside of our facility, keep it simple. Provide very specific instructions. You may have had a culture in your organization where you trusted your employees, you gave them a framework, and you trusted them to make the right decision. And you've really delegated a lot of that decision-making to employees. When we're dealing with a cognitive overload, we have to be aware that it's more challenging to make those decisions. And so we will need to provide more specific instructions to our employees, our volunteers, to the stakeholders in a more specific, concrete way than we may have had to do in the past. We also have to stay honest. Conditions will change. We may have had, for example, more infections in our community, and we'll need to be honest and transparent. We will need to also be more redundant. We have to repeat ourselves so that that information can be processed. In the past, a simple email may have been enough. Now we need to be redundant with a social media post, an email, and then a note on our website. And finally, and this is not finally as the last thing to do, but the first thing to do, is we have to lead with empathy. Lead with that grace, lead with this acknowledgement that there is a great deal of uncertainty. Now, it is important when you're thinking about the decisions and communicating those decisions is who receives what information on why the decision was made. So we move from the very core, which is who makes the decisions, for example, our board of directors, and then we move out to the insiders of our organizations, staff, volunteers, and then those who are in our target audience. Now, there is more information provided to the insiders of our organization than there is to the outsiders of our organization. For example, you may post a sign that says, "Wear a mask before entering our office." But to the employees, you might say, "We are going to require everyone to wear a mask. However, I want everyone to know that we do not have any cases of coronavirus here among our employees." Again, as we're transparent and honest, that will help our employees feel less uncertain, and it will help them understand what the decision is and help them embrace the decision that we're making. So some of our messaging to insiders includes staff, volunteers, donors, patrons, stakeholders, clients. And so you're going to give a more specific message to them. And then our messaging to our target audience is going to be those folks who are interested, but not yet in relationship with us. So that could be those folks who have in the past inquired about volunteering. It could be those who we suspect may be donors, and I know that that's a terrible term, but it is the term we use in fundraising. We suspect that they would be interested. They, in giving to our organization, they have come to a fundraising event. They have come to our outreach event. So we know that they are likely to be interested. We also think about who our potential partners are. For example, there might be as a part of a collaboration or a coalition that you're involved in, and there might be new partners who enter into it. It could be new revenue partners. So if you are looking at some earned income opportunities, or you are going to be working with some governmental organizations, knowing what messages that you would have more generally that aren't as detailed, but are messages to them. And finally, we have to be aware of possible negative headlines. We don't need to be afraid of them, but we have to be aware of them. For example, if we are an organization that invites folks from around the nation to come to be involved in our programs, there is still the 14-day quarantine that is required by our governor. And if we were to continue to invite those folks from out of state without any messaging around only Montana residents are going to participate right now, then we will probably have some type of negative headline at some point. And it could be on social media, it could come through a post, it could come through just the community conversation, or it could be a headline in a newspaper article or on the news. And as you can imagine, if, for example, you were inviting out-of-state folks to come and participate in your program, and then your organization became the focus of an outbreak, that would not look good for your organization. Some messaging pitfalls. One is too much or too little information. we either range from too much and there's just an information overload and our insiders cannot process the information, to too little, and you have just so much uncertainty that it actually causes even more cognitive difficulties in processing information. It is okay to say, we don't know yet. We are making this decision. We plan to have a board meeting next week, or we don't know yet, but this is what we're looking at to make the decision. The other messaging pitfall that can happen is if you choose not to respond in a crisis communication scenario. To give you an example, a colleague of mine is working with a nursing home in Florida, and they had a huge outbreak in that nursing home. The senior management were all fired. And then over the weekend, the employees had to deal with questions from the media, and none of them knew how to respond. And they were put in a really awkward situation in trying to express their empathy. But the board of directors told the employees that they were not allowed to talk with anybody. So that's an example of things that can go very poorly. And I bet you those employees are probably going to be looking at changing jobs as soon as they can, because that's an awful situation to put employees in. So as you are thinking about moving forward, there is this situation where we can be overwhelmed with making these decisions. And so I just want to encourage all of us to think about, it is normal to experience decision paralysis. It is absolutely normal for us to want to avoid making certain decisions because they're hard. It takes a lot of considerations of what could happen, what might happen, and what will happen based on our decision, especially in a time when there is so much uncertainty. We are receiving new information every day, and so it can feel like we just can't make a decision right now because we don't know enough information, or we're just not prepared to make that decision. The good news, and something to remember, is that we will likely have to alter that decision. It just will happen. We know that minimally, we will be going through this phased reopening. There's 3 phases to it. We're only in the first phase. So we will likely have to alter our decision in phase 2, and then we'll have to alter it in phase 3. We know that we will be altering all of those decisions. And I hope you take that as a moment to relieve yourself of some of the stress, because you know that you're going to have to alter this decision. It is not set in stone. It is not permanent. We will also likely have to alter our decisions in the fall when we're expecting a reoccurrence of the virus, especially as it is hitting at the same time as influenza is. So just know that we will have to alter those decisions. Keep in mind, good enough is better than no decision. We have to make a decision for various different elements. And if we don't, then we can't move forward as an organization. We will get more and more questions from our employees, from our volunteers, our donors. We also have to have good enough messaging. We have to just start communicating what some of our decisions are. If we don't, then that will lead to misinformation and more uncertainty. And then finally, I would encourage you to reach out to your fellow leaders in the subsector that you're working in. So I was talking with a client yesterday, and they have weekly meetings with similar arts organizations, and they meet just to talk through some of the decisions that they're making. They are making different decisions that are best for their organizations, but having that sounding board has been very valuable for all of the leaders involved in that particular phone call. So do reach out to your fellow leaders. We had the wonderful opportunity to reach out through all of the MNA groups that are happening, to really share ideas, to talk through decisions, and to brainstorm how do we move forward. And then lastly, I would like to throw it out to all of you to talk about what you are doing to care for yourself when you are facing that decision paralysis. So with that, I'm going to open this up to Adam or Shelby to, if there's any questions in the chat, and then also for you to respond to what you are doing when faced with decision paralysis.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tani. That was a great presentation. We had a question earlier when you were first walking through the matrix of decisions that folks are considering from Larry Barron, and Larry, feel free to clarify, but he was curious if that's assuming that your donors think in a certain way. You know, if you have donors that don't like an overly conservative approach and a nonprofit is choosing not to serve them, how does a nonprofit weigh or assess that perception? Maybe
Right.
the other side. Yeah.
Yeah, and that is going back to following along that the social implementing guidelines. How are you thinking about adapting to your organization's cultures? There are some of us who are serving in Eastern Montana, or we are serving a more conservative audience who really feel it very strongly that we need to move forward with reopening very quickly. And that is something that you have to think about your own audience and how they perceive that. We do know that donors are giving right now, both to direct and indirect services. And so it is important to have those conversations, pick up the phone, talk with some of your key donors and get their insight in terms of how you're doing the reopening. But caveat is that reality is, as we see in the virus infections increase in Montana, which is just a natural part of that slowing the spread, more people will know more people who've been affected. And so that might change. So those who are working with more conservative audiences may actually start pulling back in a few weeks. And so they might have a different perspective. So keep that in mind, give everybody grace that it's okay to change our minds. So, what else? You're muted.
It's good to be changing our minds. A quick question that I just wanted to acknowledge it, and then what we might do is ask one of our HR folks. But from Sarah, when you were touching on unemployment, it was her understanding that if employees turn down work, they become ineligible for unemployment. Are you able to speak to that and your understanding?
I am not, but I do know that we're seeing an increase of folks who they are approaching their employers and saying, please furlough me because I can't afford to continue working when I'm dealing with the added childhood or childcare expenses. And so they are requesting to be furloughed.
Okay. And so we will, we'll see from some of our HR consultants if there's any language in there or guidance for that, Sarah, but I think that's a good question. Chani, this is from Kathleen Castle. Do you have any advice for a museum reopening in Montana? And, you know, recognizing that many of their guests and visitors are from out of town and often from other states.
Yes, and that is that challenge. Just from experience, I live in Big Fork. We are seeing a lot of our vacation homeowners and our snowbirds coming back right now, and they're not self-quarantining. They're not. And so what that means is that when you're thinking about reopening a museum, thinking about the social distancing guidelines that there are in terms of the number of people in the museum, thinking about how you are disinfecting the museum, all of those pieces, but then also realize there is going to be a higher risk because of those tourists. So thinking about how you reopen, you need to think about, is there ways for us to continue to remain closed but offer the benefits that we offer? I would encourage you to look at the National Cowboy Museum and Western Heritage right now. They're in Oklahoma. They are closed, but they are just killing it online in their Twitter. And they're seeing an increased engagement, and they're actually posting every day multiple exhibits and getting a huge amount of publicity, but also public awareness. And so think about what other museums are doing and whether or not that is something that you could do.
I think that's a great point, Shani. We've seen, examples from Montana and nationally of this creativity in the face of difficult decisions. And so I think sharing those examples, it's always a high point of seeing what folks are doing and helping us kind of creatively problem solve uncertainty.
And to that a little bit further, one of my clients, they are actually providing grants to artists right now to produce content. And that content is being shared with other arts organizations. And so that's a way, again, creativity of, if you're in an arts organization, it can look differently. And that's one way that this particular arts organization is supporting both the artists, but also showing the benefit they have to the community.
I think just to speak to that, we have some other folks that are considering summer programming for students and kids. And I think while there isn't a clear-cut answer, the one thing we can certainly say is if you decide to move forward with reopening a program or a space, it's going to look different this summer and this year. And that's probably where some of that crux and the meat of your next steps really take place is how can we make this safe? How can we make it affordable? And I think your matrix sets us up really nicely to have the first conversation and then the follow-up conversation. So I so appreciate that.
Glad to. So in thinking about that summer programming, one of the things to be aware of is that what is the cost for reopening? And then what is the cost for closing up again? So if there is, for example, a spike in outbreaks, then how much will it cost to close? And keep that as a part of that decision making. So what other questions came up? Or ideas that folks have for just reducing that decision paralysis that they may feel?
Scan in the chat now. So we do have from Larry sort of an anti-technology screen time policy with serving children, and that's been hurting alternative services that this organization has been providing, which I'm sure is not uncommon,
right?
With some outdoor rec and other programs in the state.
Yeah, I agree. And we are even talking about it for adults. We're starting to have that conversation about Zoom fatigue, that it is so difficult to have so much screen time and be expected to be operating in this environment. That's even more so for kids. And so thinking about, are there ways to provide kits for kids to do at home with their family that are tangible, that you can do together, that it does reduce that screen time.
Absolutely. From the individual, Rebecca said she's been, walking, running, gardening to clear her mind when overwhelmed. Those individual self-care things to organizationally. At MNA, we've been really looking at ourselves and also for the sector. How can we help organizations narrow their lenses a little bit, not of their mission or programming, but with all the uncertainty they're facing. And so whether that means some scenario planning tools for you to be able to plan out different scenarios that Adam has been working on and will be presenting on Thursday. We hope to see you guys there. Or whether it's trying to figure out what your overall general response strategy is and what are then some specific narrowed questions. I think we're all trying to figure out everything all at once. And so being able to narrow that lens can give you a place to start moving from, at least, which has been helpful. And I think your matrix does exactly the same thing, which is appreciated.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
And stop the share. Is there any other questions that have come up?
Not so far. Last chance, and we will send out a recording as well as the slideshow and this Chani's handout to everyone later this afternoon. And one question, this is from Terry Nichols. We're a network organization supporting smaller nonprofits, and we've been mostly deferring to those smaller nonprofits to make their own decisions. To what extent should umbrella organizations be making decisions for those we serve?
That is a fantastic question. So there's two areas. You're of course going to be leading in your community, in your subsector. So what decisions are you making, and how can you share how you came to those decisions, so that the smaller nonprofits you serve can look at the decisions that you're making and think through those same considerations and those same caveats. Then on the flip side is just understanding that they're not going to be able to lead in the community. They're going to need to look at just basic liability, especially if there's just limitations on what they can do for providing the same level of services as a smaller nonprofit. They may not have the staff, they may not have the volunteers, their volunteers may be older and then don't feel comfortable participating in activities. So just being aware that you're going to have to help them make some of those decisions that are at a lower level than you would make, but is important to allow them to continue to operate as an organization.
Very well said. Complex and difficult question. Just a note in here as well from Judith at Montana Racial Equity Project, a consideration of urging everyone who employs anyone that is Black, Indigenous, or people of color to allow more weeks of distancing time, as we are much more likely to suffer serious consequences if we contract the virus. And that's based on a lot of research and news that's unfortunately coming across our headlines every day. So a note there if you're able. Thank you, Judith.
And also be aware of, like I just pointed out, the masks, is that there are some things that there is some stereotypes that come with it. And so keep those in mind as well.
Absolutely. Well, wonderful. If you have additional questions, please feel free to pass them along. We're right around 3 o'clock. Chani, I want to thank you for your time and thought and practice in creating this for us today. And thank you everyone for attending, and good luck. Keep us in mind as you're making decisions, and we'll see what resources we can point you towards. Thank you.
Thank you.